Hi, folks. Dr. Chris Kugler here in Lecture 2 of 8 in this course on New Testament Christology. And in this short lecture, we're going to talk a little bit and consider a little bit about the Jewish context of the origins, rise, and expression of New Testament Christology. What makes the Jewish context so important is a couple of reasons. One is the earliest Christians. The earliest Christians were, of course, Jews. Jesus of Nazareth himself was a Jew. Paul, who wrote the majority of the New Testament, was a Jew. Our earliest author, of course, in the New Testament was a Jew. And all of Jesus' earliest disciples, most of the earliest Christians, before the Pauline mission, when Paul went round about the Mediterranean world and attempted to spread the message to all and sundry, as it were, Gentiles included, it was largely a Jewish messianic movement. And therefore, if one wants to understand the range of views available to Jesus of Nazareth, to Paul the Apostle, to all of the earliest Jewish Christians, one needs to get a sense, of course, of what Jews in the first century might have thought about quote-unquote theology in general, and about God, Israel's God, Yahweh in particular, about his relationship to reality, his potential relationship to human beings, to prophets, to would-be messianic figures, as in the case of Jesus, etc. So one can get a sense of the range of options available to first century Jews if they wanted robustly to express their exalted view of a particular figure other than Israel's God Yahweh, or at least a figure who was associated with Israel's God but distinct from Israel's God. How could they have done that? What theological, conceptual, scriptural resources were available to them for doing so? The other reason for that, of course, is that the Jewish tradition, by and large, in its ancient context, was quite distinctive, precisely on this point, on other points as well, but precisely on this point. Most of the wider Mediterranean context, philosophical, religious, theological, cultic, was a polytheistic context, widespread belief in a whole plethora of gods that did all sorts of things, from creating the cosmos to maintaining the cosmos to interacting with various human beings, to interacting with the seasons, to interacting with agriculture, trade, etc. The whole plethora of human existence gods were associated with in most societies round about the Mediterranean world. But for the Jewish tradition, especially during the exilic period, that is the period roughly from 587 to 538 BC, and after the exilic period, the 500 years, the 5 centuries leading up to the time of Jesus, was widely characterized in the Jewish theology of the time as adherence to an expression of what we might call rigorous, exclusivist Jewish monotheism. Now, the picture is a bit more complicated than that, and that's what this lecture is about. After all, lots of scholars would contest the use of the label monotheism. Monotheism, meaning one, monotheism, God, one, the belief in one God, the cultic devotion to one God. Lots of scholars would contest that view, and their contestations are understandable. So let's talk a bit, ultimately incorrect, I think, but understandable. So let's talk a bit about that. It does seem to be the case, excuse me, from the archaeological record that prior to the exile, the Babylonian exile in 587 BC, in the archaeological record, archaeologists can find all sorts of what they call idol figurines, that is, small depictions, small material depictions of various gods in the land of Judea, probably gods that were personal idols that people had in their homes, perhaps traveled with them, whatever. That those have been found and attested to in the archaeological record prior to the exilic period in layers of the soil that predate the exilic period. Of course, that comports rather well with the Old Testament, which indicates really all the way from Genesis through the whole of the Old Testament through Second Chronicles that Jews really did struggle with polytheism, that is, worshiping other gods, whether it was Baal or Asherah or whoever, or whether it was actually crafting cult idols, little figurine depictions of these gods and using them in their personal lives and their homes, whatever. That the Old Testament tells us that that was a persistent problem among the Jewish people, particularly prior to the exile. Indeed, the Old Testament tells us that the principal reason, the principal way in which the Jewish people broke their covenant with God, the covenant established with Abraham and ratified in a sense with the gift of Torah through Moses, the way in which they broke that covenant is they were unfaithful to Israel's God. And that unfaithfulness, of course, is depicted often in the Old Testament, particularly in the prophets, as marital infidelity, because the covenant with Yahweh was often depicted in marital terms. Yahweh is Israel's groom, Israel is the bride, and Israel, by going after other gods, has been unfaithful to Yahweh. So, for the pre-exilic period, lots of scholars wonder just how monotheistic, just how devoted singularly to Israel's God Yahweh were the Jewish people. And that's a contested question which goes on in scholarship. How singularly were they even devoted in the first temple established around about 1000 BCE? So those debates go on. But even with the exile, and even with the return of the Jews from Babylon to Judea, and even with the archaeological record from that period, which gives us barely any evidence, if any evidence, of the production and use of idol figurines, with all of the texts produced after the exile, which give us very, very sparse evidence that idolatry and polytheism were persistent problems. What are we to characterize the Jewish tradition as then? The so-called Second Temple Jewish tradition, from the rebuilding of the Second Temple, the building of the Second Temple under Ezra and Nehemiah in the late 6th century, all the way to the time of Jesus and the destruction of the temple during 70 AD. What are we to make of the Jewish tradition of this period? Is it monotheistic? How ought we to think about it? After all, during this time period, one sees the growth of the angelological tradition, that the belief and the attestation to and the speculation about angels was widespread in this period. Even very exalted angels, particularly one thinks of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The figure of Michael, the great archangel in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in other Jewish traditions, is depicted in remarkably exalted terms. And particularly, this angel is depicted in exalted terms, not least in dependence upon a couple of key Old Testament texts about the angel of Yahweh, whether that's in Genesis 16, whether that's in Exodus 23, where it said, in the angel of the Lord, Yahweh says, my name is in him. And there's this tight and close association between Israel's God Yahweh and the revelation of himself, a theophany of himself, and that theophany being depicted in terms of the angel of the Lord tradition. So what sense should we make of that and the way in which that plays out in, let's say, the Dead Sea Scrolls with the great Michael traditions? So you have the angelological traditions. You have the traditions of exalted patriarchs. First off, the tradition in Genesis 5 where it says, Enoch walked with God for 300 years and then was no more, was taken into heaven, whatever. Lots of Jews puzzled over that text and said, well, what happened to him next? And in particular, there's a tradition in 1 Enoch. It's a pseudepigraphical tradition that is largely attested at Qumran, but is attested elsewhere, in which it is speculated that Enoch was assumed into heaven, had communion with the angels, was massively exalted, and was somehow to be identified with that mysterious and exalted figure in Daniel 7, referred to as the Son of Man. You might know the tradition in Daniel 7 where the Son of Man comes with the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days, and he's given dominion and authority and rule, and all the nations shall be subservient to him, etc. So Enoch is depicted in remarkably exalted terms, okay? Then you have Moses in Ezekiel the tragedian and various other traditions being depicted in remarkably exalted terms, not least on the basis of texts like in Exodus where the text says that God was going to make Moses as a god, as Elohim to Pharaoh, in terms of terrifying Pharaoh and communicating to Pharaoh the seriousness of the situation, that Israel's God was going to rescue his people, whether Pharaoh was going to accept that or not. And so you have the traditions of Moses' exaltation. You have the messianic speculations of the period, perhaps most notably the Psalms of Solomon, probably written sometime in the 1st century BC. We don't know when, but all sorts of exalted speculation in Psalms of Solomon 17 and 18 in particular about a coming Davidic Messiah and how exalted he might be. In the pseudepigraphical books called 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch, the coming Messiah is depicted as a pre-existent figure that pre-exists the creation of the cosmos and will be revealed. What is the sense of that messianic speculation? Is that an actual conceptual and theological prefigurement of the pre-existence of Jesus of Nazareth in the early Christian tradition? The Son of Man, and in the similitudes of Enoch, the Enoch tradition I referred to a minute ago, in that Enochic tradition in 1 Enoch chapters 37 to 71, the Son of Man figure is depicted as pre-existing the creation of the cosmos and enjoying communion with God prior to the creation of the cosmos. So very exalted speculations. Sometimes angels featured in prayers during this period. Not so much evidence of direct prayer to angels in the sense that the human praying thought that prayer stopped with the angel and the angel was sufficient to answer prayers irrespective of the God of Israel, but angels were often invoked in the company of heaven alongside the God of Israel in prayer. So this whole context of the Jewish tradition shapes what we ought to think and to say about the origins and rise of New Testament Christology, what the earliest Christians thought about Jesus and his relationship to God and his relationship to them, and what Jesus himself thought about that dynamic. So can we speak of Second Temple Jewish monotheism? Or is it the case that the Messianic speculation, the angelological traditions, the exalted patriarch traditions, etc., do all those erode the sense in which Jews were rigorous, exclusivist Jewish monotheists? Is it the case that they were quite happy to countenance the exaltation and existence of other beings which we should really consider properly divine? After all, some figures in the Old Testament itself are called Elohim or El. Both Hebrew words can be words used for Israel's God. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, often the angels are called Elim, which is a word for God. So how ought we to, and there are other such traditions, how ought we to think about this? A couple of points. Just because the Jewish tradition Hebrew uses the word El or Elohim or Elim, which are all Hebrew words, which can mean God, it doesn't mean that they're referring to beings which they think exist on the same ontological level as Israel's God. El, Elohim, Elim were words which had a wide denotation and connotation of meaning, and could regularly refer to beings which simply existed in heaven. Supernatural beings existing in heaven with and alongside God could be referred to as El, Elohim, Elim. And in that sense, really, what the Hebrew words mean are supernatural or heavenly beings in our language. It's not a linguistic convention for denoting beings which, in those texts, from the perspective of those texts, actually exist on the same level as the God of Israel and compete with him for supremacy, divinity, sovereignty, etc. That is not the case, so don't get hung up on that linguistic convention. And the depiction of exalted patriarchs doesn't erode the robustness of the Jewish monotheism. It is an interesting phenomenon in its own right, which deserves explication, but it doesn't erode the robust and exclusivist Jewish monotheism. Neither does angel speculation, I think, erode the robustness, the exclusivity of the Jewish monotheism in this period. Angels serve a couple of purposes. One being that the Jewish texts which make use of the depiction of angels partly do so, of course, they believe in angels, but partly do so because the depiction of angels suffusing the cosmos and interacting with human beings allows one simultaneously to depict the God of Israel enthroned in heaven, sovereign and in control of the universe, yet dynamically active in that universe with all sorts of issues and human beings. In other words, it allowed Jewish texts conceptually to express their twin beliefs in the immanence of Israel's God and in the transcendence of Israel's God. Transcendence, so enthroned and sovereign; immanence, so active in and through his angelic mediators. So that's a large part of what the angel traditions are doing. And they're doing other things too, but that is a large part of the point. So it's not the case, I think, that when a young Jewish prophet comes on the scene in and as the person of Jesus of Nazareth, that the Jewish monotheistic tradition is just ready-made for the belief that this human messianic figure very well might be divine, like the God of Israel is divine, the second person of the Trinity, the actual incarnation of Israel's God, or anything like that. I do not think that that was a widespread view of the Jewish tradition. Of course, Jesus of Nazareth, in prayer and in scriptural reflection, had some key texts and traditions with which to work in terms of exploring what might be the case in his own person and in his own work. Could it be on the basis of Psalm 110, and especially in certain textual traditions of Psalm 110, that the coming Messiah would be a pre-existent being that might be begotten of God in not just a metaphorical sense? So that was there. Daniel 7, that there might come a messianic figure that would be so exalted that it would be appropriate to depict him as riding on the clouds of heaven. So there are robust speculations that are in the air in the Jewish tradition with which a Jew like Jesus of Nazareth could work and pray through and try out, and that all of his Jewish followers could work and pray through and try out. So yes, there is a range of options in and through which, in prayer and in work, Jesus of Nazareth could have felt his way, could have pushed, could have yearned forward into what eventually would become divine Christology. But I don't think it's the case that divine Christology in total was already a ready-made Jewish category of the time. So that is our Jewish context, and it should frame everything that we do and say about New Testament Christology.